Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Park Church. I am so pleased that y'all have made some time in your busy lives, braved this West Michigan crazy day where we started with 11 inches of snow and now it's summer, and you have made your way into this place. If you do not know me, my name is Reverend Daryl Kissler. I am the current senior minister here at Park Church, and on behalf of our leadership, our board of deacons, I want to welcome you to this wonderful night where we are going to hear and to exchange ideas with one of the great thinkers and pastorvists. That's a word I just made up. It's pastor, it's activist, it's a pastorvist who is doing great work on the lines of and in the trenches of Christian ministry. Of course, you are here to see John Pavlovitz, and we are so pleased that he is here tonight. You know John as a writer, as a podcaster, as a preacher, as a teacher, and you know that he is working to build what he calls a bigger table. And he has set a place for you in the name of Christ to join him around that bigger table and to build authentic, messy, spiritual relationships. And so I hope that you find tonight edifying and uplifting, inspiring and challenging, so that as we leave this place, we may do what we can to share God's extravagant love and grace and mercy and truly see each other as members of the one human family. But without further ado, can you please give a warm West Michigan welcome to our good friend, John Pavlovitz.
Thank you, Dad. Thank you. Appreciate it, buddy. Well, good evening, friends. It is so good to be with you. I was misled about the weather. I actually packed what is my equivalent of a parka, and I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to use the gloves that I packed or the hat or any of that. So thank you. I'm glad it turned out the way it did. I'm so grateful that you're here. I am so excited to be here with the lovers and the healers and the helpers and the activists and the caregivers and the damn givers in Michigan. You are dear to my heart. This is actually the fourth or fifth time that I have been invited to this area, and I keep wondering why people keep showing up. So I just thank you for spending some of your time with me. What I know about tonight is it's going to be fantastic. Right? Tonight is exciting, right? It's not exciting because I'm here. It's exciting because we get to gather in this place, and humanity has never been arranged in this specific configuration in the history of the planet, right? So what we're doing tonight is unprecedented, and what we do tonight is historic. And what we're going to do tonight, if we do it right, is going to change the world outside of this building, which is what we want, right? It's going to be beautiful to have an experience of community and to look around and have like-hearted people around us and to exhale the way that you can exhale when you are with people who get you. And that's going to be beautiful. But the goal should be that we leave here changed so that we alter the place outside of this building. So the last time I was here in this area was 2019. Now, since then, we've had a historic and deadly planetary health crisis. We've had a coup attempt. We have had a white Christian nationalist terrorist group kind of rising up in our midst. So I would say call the babysitter. We're going to be a while, right? We have a lot to talk about. So a little bit of an introduction for those of you who don't know me. 25 years ago, I was working as an art director for the Franklin Mint. I was designing Princess Diana plates and Lord of the Rings chess sets, and I was drafted into local church pastoral ministry. And that all began when I was sitting in the second highly polished pew of a tiny suburban Pennsylvania church where my wife and I had recently been married. And the service was nearly ending, and I was sitting there thinking deeply spiritual thoughts, like where we were going to eat that afternoon, and whether the Eagles' offensive line could handle the Giants' defensive pressure, very spiritual things. And a woman tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around, And she said, John, I have been thinking about you and praying about you, and I think you would make an amazing youth leader. And I just smiled and thought to myself, I know you. You're the current youth leader. She had done her time. She had paid her debt to society. She was getting out, and she was looking for a victim, a sucker, a volunteer, a minister of the Lord. And I fit the two main criteria for small church youth ministry. I was young, and I was there. And she said, what would you think about coming to our youth meeting tonight and just seeing what we're about? And I thought, well, what could that alter about the complete trajectory of my life? But it was a pivot point moment for me. Because over the weeks and months that followed, I realized that I loved working with teenagers. That I had an affinity for the very turbulent time of adolescence, that I wanted to spend time with the people most reasonable adults avoided. I was like a demented storm chaser. Like, that looks horrible, let's go there. And something really miraculous happened as I began to teach these young people about a faith that I did not really have at the time. My faith began to grow. And I finally made the decision after a couple of years to leave my career as an art director, enter into full-time ministry. And that's the place where I've been for really the past 25 years of my life. But the most recent decade of that, I've been working, overseeing this sort of disparate, sprawling, virtual congregation made up of people all over the planet. And in my travels, both in person and online, I do some speaking, but I do a lot of listening too. I hear or read hundreds of stories each month. And at this point, I don't consider myself an author or a blogger, or even a pastor. I consider myself a collector of stories, a war correspondent. I get into a different town or a new environment, or I reach people where they are online, and I step into the trenches of life with people, and I say, tell me what's happening here on the ground so I can tell the folks back home. And this gives me a front row seat to the varied experience of being human. And people, they give me proximity to their pain. They show me their grief. They share with me their struggles. They reveal to me their dreams. And I sit with them and I listen to the words they share. And I leave my time with them asking, what are they trying to say that they can't quite verbalize? What do they wish more people could hear if their voices could carry? How can I connect their humanity to the humanity that does not share geographic or relational space with them? And that's the place I write and speak and minister from. I try to be a translator of diverse experience. So let's start there. I just flew in today, and I'm here on the ground. So, Michigan, tell me, what's happening here on the ground? What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are you feeling? And really, why are you here? Somebody share a couple, just put up your hand, tell me why you're here. I'll repeat so everyone here can hear. And by the way, is it difficult to see me here? Everybody okay? Because I'm gonna bring my music stand because I feel like this is just, I might as well be in Raleigh if I'm gonna be this far away from you. So let me do that. So tell me, why are you here? Just put up your hand and I'll repeat your words. Yes. Oh, you've been inspired by my book. Thank you. This is an unexpected life path for me. This was, there was ministry, but there was an art director before that. Then there is whatever this is that I am now. It's a complete surprise. So it's just really gratifying that there are even people in this room tonight. So thank you. Facebook. You follow me on Facebook. You read everything I write? That's so much more than my wife reads. I'll refer to something I said, and she'll say, what? And I'll, of course, yes. Thank you. I helped you keep your sanity during the last administration. Well, I don't know what happened to mine because it's gone, but I'm glad. Thank you. This is what we do here and what I do online. I was sharing with some of the staff here, and thanks to Pastor Darrell and this entire church staff, they're fantastic. And we were talking about the way that I have experienced over the past year and a half. I had a minor surgery on my brain. It was only minor because my brain is very small, right? But so what I learned over that time was the reciprocal nature of this community. It's not just me putting out content, but that you are actually in a part of my life, and there is an exchange of community. So knowing people are reading what I'm writing, because I'm just like you, I'm trying to figure out what's going on here and how we get through. A couple others. Why are you here? Yes, in the back. The world is falling apart, and that's why, yes, over the next, 3 or 4 hours we're going to be here. We're going to fix it all. Hope you had a nutritious dinner. I'm a voice of reason. I am simply the voice of myself, because what I found was, and my story, if I could share more, is when I was a local church pastor, it was very difficult representing everyone in my community, or trying to I feel the collective weight of the congregation. And then what happened when I was outside of that, then I could simply speak explicitly and authentically, and those words just do the work that they're going to do. And I'm so glad when those words reach people like yourself. So thank you. How did we get so fragmented, and how are we going to change? Those questions are too difficult for me to answer, but thank you for asking them. Well, the reason we got fragmented is very complex, but it involves basically the leveraging of fear, phobia, and prejudice, that when religion and politics at their worst do that. And so when those things create in someone a relentless fear, when they are perpetually terrified, they're going to make poor decisions. And what I think we see, and what we've seen for a while now, is a religious system and a political system that is built on needing an adversary, needing an encroaching enemy, someone to be the bad, oppressive, dangerous thing coming, so that they can get the people in a defense posture. And so, in a short answer, that's where we are, because no one is at their best when they're afraid. And we have people who are terrified making others terrified. I shared last week, I was speaking in Huntsville, Alabama. The talk went really well, but it was in a theater and was like really blinding lights. And I finished the talk and we got done, and my host is driving me home, and she said, "Did you see that the problematic individual?" And I said, "No, was some member of my family here?" And then they said, "No, there was a man who came in about 20 minutes into the talk, had a mask on with a certain political figure on it, dark sunglasses and a baggy long coat, and stood up in the aisle just like this, and they escorted him out." But I wrote a letter to that person and put it on social media, and I said, "First, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I didn't know you were there, so if you were trying to intimidate me, you're going to have to do it again." And the second thing I said was, I'm sorry, I want you to think about your politics and your theology and see if they're doing something positive for you, because I wish you could have come as yourself without a mask and listened to what I shared, and then asked any question you wanted, and we could have had an exchange of ideas as human beings. But that's, I think, why we're seeing that fragmentation. Well, here's how this is going to go. I'm going to speak for somewhere between 25 and 500 minutes, and then I'm going to open the floor. We're going to have some conversation, and then I'll close us intentionally so that we can sort of leave together. One of the invitations from the community here was to speak on the ideas of equality and equity. And it's interesting because equity has been in the news over the past couple of days. I don't know if you know this, but the governor of Virginia basically said, "Hey, we really don't want to embrace equity because it could be very dangerous if we do." So here's what I want to do real quickly. One of the truths, people often say they use equity and equality interchangeably, but these things are not completely interchangeable. Both of them, equity and equality, are ideas that people of faith, morality, and conscience should be passionate about, which I know you are. But they're related and yet distinct. And not surprisingly, the same people who oppose equality also oppose equity, okay? One of the truths I try to share with people as I travel is that we exist in both stories and in systems. The stories are the individual human beings we encounter, right? Original, unprecedented, once in history, never to be repeated creations with both singular uniqueness, but yet the same inherent value, right? If you're a person of faith, you believe that every single human being bears the image of God, that they carry a spark of the divine, or if you're not a religious person, that they are made of the same beautiful, mysterious stuff that you are. So each of these individual stories should have respect befitting that fact. Every life is a story. But these lives exist in community. They exist in systems, right? In larger realities, in environments with rules and with barriers and supports that all come to bear on those individual stories. There are systems that govern and influence and either nurture or impede the stories. So we might think about equality as the inherent value of a human being and their right to receive every human and civil right that any other has. So equality could be thought of as identical reverence for each person sitting in this spot where you happen to be, okay? But equity speaks to the reality that each person has not traveled the same road to this spot, that the obstacles and the adversity have not been identical. So a simple illustration might be, let's say we were charging for this talk tonight. We're not, but let's say we are. Surprise! Let's say we were charging $20 for this talk tonight, and I gave 10 random people in the community a free ticket. That would be a surface affirmation of their comparable worth as people, as human beings. It would be a gesture of acknowledging equality, but it would not account for the fact that each of these 10 people's various transportation needs, let's say. Some might not own cars, or they might not be able to afford gas. It wouldn't take into account that some of these people might have children and they might not have family support around them or friends or be able to afford childcare. Some of them might not be in a position to take off of work, or they might not feel welcomed in a church because of the color of their skin or their sexual orientation, or because they have had a bad past experience of church. So while a free $20 ticket has an equal value and is offering the opportunity to get into the door here, the ticket in itself doesn't acknowledge the reality that other forces may not make accepting the invitation possible for each of them. Does that make sense? What equity seeks to ask is, what can we do to make sure that everyone can get into this gathering with a similar amount of effort and sacrifice and relative cost and relative trauma? We are trying to remove the barriers of environment and circumstance. And see, as difficult as equality is to achieve that respecting of story, equity is a far more difficult aspiration, because equity takes on the question of fairness and then justice. And I want to give you a little update. We don't like justice much. See, justice is incredibly subjective, right? It's an incredibly subjective thing, and it may require us to actually change the system, a system that we might benefit from, right? In order to move closer to equity, there may be a cost. Some people may have to be convenienced as the system is renovated. And it's usually those who have enjoyed the benefits of the flawed system. Paul Dressel of Race Matters Institute says, the route to achieving equity will not be accomplished through treating everyone equally. It will be achieved by treating everyone justly according to their circumstance. So let me paint it to you this way. If you call your local cable provider to establish service, Invariably, you'll be talking to the customer service representative. They're going to make you an offer. They're going to say, if you'd like to add internet and phone, we can package those services and they'll be much cheaper than if you purchase them separately or from another vendor. This packaging of services is known as what? Bundling. Isn't bundling great? Bundling makes everything better. Life is so much better when you bundle. See, I love to bundle because it makes me feel like I'm getting something for free. It makes me feel like I'm getting preferential treatment when I'm actually being fleeced. But the preferential treatment is something that I've gotten quite used to. Because I'm 53 years old, and I'm more than a little embarrassed to say that it took me far too many of those years to even begin to realize that as a white, cisgender, heterosexual man, I have the privilege bundle. It was paid for me long before I arrived here. I was grandfathered in. Actually, I was great-great-great-grandfathered in. The color of my skin and my gender, my orientation, my profession of faith, my very physicality, all buffered me from many varieties of adversity. They formed a barrier against a great deal of struggle that others experience as routine. They opened doors that I didn't even realize had been opened for me. And they afforded me a vast multitude of advantages, some of which I've come to realize, and others I will never be made aware of. And I've come to realize that I have been the beneficiary of inequity. And many of the people in this room have been a beneficiary of inequity. But you know what's funny? That isn't the story that I told myself for most of my life. For the first few decades of my life, I lived with a set of assumptions about equity based largely on the particular arrangement of my privilege. So growing up, I would have told you that anyone who wanted to work hard had the same opportunities to succeed. Even though if my mother were here, she would say, you never worked very hard and you somehow managed to succeed. Back then, I would have told you that everyone has access to an education, all the while attending a private school that many families couldn't afford, all while having two parents who were fully engaged in my life and never wanting for a meal or clothes or transportation or well-paid teachers or conditions that allowed me to thrive. Back then, I would have told you that anyone who followed the rules and obeyed the laws and respected law enforcement would have nothing to fear during a traffic stop. And yet I can remember being 9 years old and in the back seat of our car when my father was pulled over for speeding in a school zone. And before the officer even reached him, my father opened the window and said, just give me the effing ticket. And miraculously, the officer just gave him the effing ticket. So friends, even though so much of the experiential evidence of my life testified so loudly in opposition to my working set of assumptions about the world, I held tightly to those stories because I needed them to be true. I have stayed committed for so long to a narrative that I needed to be true about equitable systems because the alternative was to have my world turned upside down. And most of us don't have time for that kind of existential crisis, do we? This is the seductive power of privilege. The more you benefit from a system, the easier it is to defend that system. The greater advantages the status quo provides you, well, the more tempted you're going to be to resist changes in it. When you've always had the best and most comfortable seat at the table, it's really difficult to imagine that there are people actually waiting outside. When you are a beneficiary of inequity, well, then equity often isn't a natural priority. When you're an inequity beneficiary, you will naturally be oblivious to injustices experienced by those inequity most dangerous. But here's the problem. Even when those injustices are made aware to you, you will intentionally or subconsciously deny their existence or become defensive about the fact that those things even exist. we're all a product of our stories, right? We all come here having walked through a very specific path that has led us to hold all the assumptions that we have, all the blind spots that we have. And all our stories have a very specific geography, a place where, in a time really where we find ourselves, a neighborhood where we have our assumptions built and our prejudices formed, our blind spots created, but it's also where we build relationships and impact lives and engage the brokenness. And for the past 25 years, my neighborhood has been mostly white churches in the South. And our churches were always diverse. Just ask us. Just look at our website. We're a diverse church. And then you'd get into the church and you'd find that we span the racial diversity from white to beige and everything in between. And if you had met me during this time when I was wrestling with what I was finding out about the reality of inequity and my being a beneficiary of it, the problem was that this was all happening when I was in that place I was not the mere mortal you see before you back then. I was someone much greater back then. Back then, I was super Christian mega pastor man. I was preaching to thousands of people. I was overseeing a massive student ministry with hundreds of volunteers. We had a shamefully large budget. I was doing meaningful work in a community that I loved and was loved by. So outwardly, it was the perfect scenario. And yet, I begin to wrestle with the reality of inequity and of my privilege and of the privilege of people who look like me. And I began to have theological questions about the nature of prayer, or questions about the Bible, or questions about the existence of hell. I started to have questions about why there were so few female pastors in our denomination. I started to have questions why were there so few people of color in our church. That was sort of my kryptonite as super Christian mega pastor man, but I experienced another form of kryptonite in that I realized that the church had actually shrunken my table. Because 10 years into ministry at this time, I looked around and realized I was only around Christians now. And I was only around Christians from my church. And I was only around Christians from my church who believed what I believed. And I was only around Christians from my church who believed what I believed, who I liked, which was basically just my wife, right? And I started to realize that I needed to get better stories, to get more diverse stories again. And so I started asking people to share their stories with me. And these were people of vulnerable communities, of oppressed communities, of underserved communities. And they started to tell me something. They used to say to me, John, this thing that you're a part of, this white evangelical church, it doesn't just seem like it wants to push me at a distance. It seems actively out to harm me. This is why this matters. Because I started to have this tension in realizing that I was super Christian mega pastor man and that fewer entities in America have been more powerful agents of inequity than the Christian church, along lines of race and gender and sexual orientation and socioeconomic level. Religion, as often as it has bent the moral arc of the universe toward justice, has pulled it away. And equity needs to matter to people of faith because Jesus, if you're a person of faith in this room, you remember Jesus, right? His command to love the least of these reminds us that the least are not those who are worth less. It's those who are treated as less by the powers and conditions and circumstances around them. They are the least seen, the least respected, the least invited, the least receiving of the things that the most of these receive without asking or having to demand it. When you are a beneficiary of inequity, it is the lack of striving in your life, the lack of need that is often the greatest barrier to you waking up. And what I love about Jesus, and if you're here and you don't talk about Jesus or you don't believe in Jesus or you don't even know why you're in a church, breathe easy. But I share this because Jesus is my tradition, and Jesus calls people into the story and into the system. See, the image that Jesus gives for himself in one of the biographies of Jesus, he calls himself the Good Shepherd. And most people go, that's really nice. Jesus is the Good Shepherd. I love it. Makes me comforted. But think about this. The idea of Jesus as the shepherd gives an expanded idea of what love looks like with regard to the stories and the systems. Yes, Jesus is the tender shepherd to those he sees as the sheep, to those he sees as harassed and helpless. To them, he is gentle and compassionate pastoral presence, but not to the wolves, not to the ones he sees as oppressing the vulnerable. To them, he is an oppositional force. To them, he is a holy terror. To those threatening the sheep, Jesus is fierce public adversary. So in his description of himself and in his life and ministry, Jesus is both compassionate personal caregiver and he's radical system influencer. He is status quo changer. He is pastor, he is activist, he is Pastorvitz, or John Pavlovitz. I don't even know what you said. That was brilliant, Pastor. We often imagine that our convictions as people of faith are to be given out individually. And yes, they are, but not completely. Because Jesus reminds us that our work and our ministries and our daily lives take us into people's paths and allow us to bring something incredibly powerful. It's called peace, and we have an obligation at all times to become the peacemakers in the world, the creators of shalom. Shalom, in my tradition growing up that came from Judaism, was an idea filled with completeness and wholeness. And shalom does not just want an absence of bad, but it wants an abundance of good. And why does all of this matter? Because people say, John, you're a Christian or you're a pastor. You really shouldn't be talking about politics. You really shouldn't be talking about all that stuff over there. Now, this tells me that they don't really know much about Jesus or that they're choosing not to remember. But it's so important that we're having this conversation in a church, whether you are a religious person or not. Because I firmly believe in the separation of church and state. But I believe it's impossible to separate my personal spirituality from engaging the world and the political systems and the social systems around us. Now, again, the people who will tell you that we shouldn't be talking about politics are using the word politics as a label to the system that they are comfortable with. Because the moment you start bringing turbulence to that system, they're going to call politics. But let's just call it how we actually treat people in the world and honor their inherent worth by giving them circumstances that allow them to flourish. That's a lot more difficult to label, right? A lot more complex. And again, the same people who oppose equality oppose equity, but they resist equity far more passionately, and here's why. Because when they have to face the idea of equity, they have to defend the often false story they tell themselves about how hard they have worked to get what they have or what they earned or what they deserve. People resistant to equity often begin to feel that someone else's gain is their loss because they've been conditioned that everything is a zero-sum game and everything is a battle and everything is us versus them and everything in the world is about the fact that they feel, even though their God is limitless, they feel like there's not enough to go around. And so what we have in this country is not a divide between Republican and Democrat or Christian and non-Christian or conservative and progressive. The divide is a vision divide in how we see other people and how we see the abundance in the world, how we see the fact that we are not in competition, we are in collaboration, that we are interdependent. This is how people of faith, morality, and conscience should view the world. And the Christian nationalist movement that we see, it runs on the fear of other people working the system, or taking handouts, or getting one over, or being lazy, when in reality, it's simply an attempt to bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. Historically speaking, we can say this in a church. In America, whiteness has been the enemy of equity. And the sooner that we all embrace it, the sooner we can move to change that. It's really simple. I was raised as a Christian, and I grew up with the words of Jesus, and Jesus would say, "Blessed are the peacemakers." You've heard that. Or the Catholic prayer of St. Francis, "Let there be peace on earth, let it begin with me." And as a lover of good music, I heard someone say, all we are saying is give peace a chance, right? So peace is important, the idea of being the maker of peace. But even without any specific worldview that's religious, without any spirituality at all, this seems like a pretty good philosophy in life, doesn't it? While we're here, it's good to make peace during our time, to reduce suffering, to alleviate pain, to facilitate health, to bring healing, to welcome the outsider, to make sure that there are more people at the table and not fewer. Seems like a pretty decent way to go through this life, right? But here's the thing. How does this actually happen, though, specifically? How is peace made? How is it fostered, nurtured, protected? What is the path to making peace? I would say that peace is an inside job, and then it's about my orientation and my movement in the world. What is the responsibility of people who want to work for equity right now? What is the responsibility of the makers of peace? Tangibly, specifically, what does that look like? For instance, think about this. We see migrants being shipped across the country by politicians in some performative stunt. And we see that, and we also see people we know who are supporting those actions. What is the peacemaker's place in that? This is the pressure point for us, because we run up against the system and the story. The system is the reality of systemic racism. The system is a look at people outside of America as evil. It's the leveraging of fear. But the story is our aunt who believes all that stuff. And that's why you're so tired, because you're stuck in this tension of the story and the system. You're stuck between the tension of your convictions and your relationships. See, this is not just theory, friends. This is the trenches of your life, the places you work, the places you live, the people you love, the people you spend Thanksgiving with. And this is not going to be an easy thing to get through. But I think it's important because I know how I'm supposed to feel about inner peace. My faith tells me that I'm supposed to have an inner peace that transcends my circumstances, right? And I can abide by that. I can be on board with that. But here's the problem. I don't feel obligated to have other people experience the shaking of being human and to be okay with it, right? I don't think it's up to me to say, I want you to have the inner peace that I have, because what my job should be as a person of faith, morality, and conscience is to be the shaking to those who are disturbing others' peace. I'm going to be back here on Sunday morning at 10:30, and we're going to talk about the calling that we have to enter in the turbulence. But I think about this every day, because you tell me your stories, and I think, does our spirituality or our morality mean we're supposed to be in the gaps between divided people, pulling them back together, or are we meant to speak and act boldly, even if it means widening the gaps and forcing people to choose a side in the conversation and the fight for equity. I think peace calls us to adopt many postures toward the same end. Think about this. In the name of peace, at times we will be silent and will be still and will withdraw to a solitary place and breathe and recalibrate and find our center. And other times we will be loud and decisive and visible. The cause of peace may lead us to decrease the shaking in the world, and it may cause us to become the shaking. See, the heart of activism of any kind is the belief that my peace is tied to someone else's. No justice, no peace. No equity, no peace. I can't be okay with the world as it is because I can see a world that is better. I wasn't having an argument with someone online. We were having a difference of opinion. His opinion was that I should no longer be alive. And you can understand I disagreed with him fundamentally. And he said, I posted some news about my recovery from my brain tumor. And he said, well, being who you are, it would have been better if you didn't survive, if you hadn't lived. And I said, what Bible are you reading? And then he went to other platforms and he asked people to bring about my early demise. And I said to him, I don't think your faith system is working for you. I said, I think that it's causing you to feel so fearful of someone else's words that you will threaten their life and imagine that you are doing something righteous. There is a world outside of this room where people disagree with us. The question is, can we move forward and oppose people's ideas and not lose their humanity? Because remember, we live in stories and in systems, and every single one of the people that we disagree with, every single person who opposes equality or equity or mercy or compassion or love or justice, they have a reason they got to that place. And it's really difficult for us while people are dehumanizing others, while they're doing such damage to vulnerable communities, to even try and love them, right? I know that. But as a person who wants to be a compassionate force, I have to try and figure that out, right? I have to at least figure that they're a product of their story. I remember I was talking about these ideas to a lesbian teenager in the lobby of a hotel. It was a conference for LGBTQ Christians and those who support them. And we were talking about all this stuff, and I felt like I was being very convincing, right? So when you're like, oh, this is good, and I'm preaching, and I'm talking to her, and she goes, John, this is all great. I believe in all the things you're talking about. But then she looks out the window, and she says, how do I love him? And outside the window was what I called Southern Baptist sign guy. He had a sign and a bullhorn, and the sign said that she was going to hell for who she was and who she loved. And he's screaming into his bullhorn, and she says, how do I love him? And I said, can I phone a friend? Right? Because I realized I was asking quite a bit of her. And what I said was, the only thing we can do is realize that we can realize two things. One, he was not born Southern Baptist sign guy. He has a group of people who spoke into his life. He has a home where he was raised, a church where he grew up. He had life experiences. He had fears and phobias leveraged to now he's there, and his life is not summed up in his identity holding that sign. And the second thing we do is we realize that right now, in his mind, he thinks he's doing something beautiful. Now, we don't excuse what he's doing, but we understand that no one thinks they're getting it wrong. You know that, right? I mean, we're right in this room. Hallelujah. But we had a gathering I was meeting at a Unitarian community in rural Georgia in a really super concentrated activism area of blue surrounded in super red stuff, okay? And we're talking in the Q&A, and a woman gets up and she grabs the microphone. She's in her late 70s, and she goes, John, what we have to do is realize that right is right and wrong is wrong, and we have right on our side, and we have to just tell all those people. And everyone starts cheering, you know. And I said, I agree with you. I think our hearts are right. I think we're on the right side of history. But I said, I also realize that right now there's a bizarro gathering across town in a very different church with a very different kind of pastor, and someone right around your age stood up with a microphone and right now is saying, John, or whoever that person is right and wrong is wrong, and we just have to fight for right because we have right on our side. So as we talk about agents of inequity, and we talk about people who live in a fear theology, we have to figure out how to make sure that we don't proceed with an arrogance that assumes that our motives are right all the time, and that our cause is just, and that our intentions are pure. But we can still think they're wrong. Why does any of this matter? Well, because the stuff that we're talking about tonight, it's not stuff. The system is big and distant. The story is in the close and the here and the now. And the stories are where people are suffering, and it's the story where they're hurting, and it's the story where they're terrified. And so we get to step into the story. And that is a beautiful thing, and it's an honor. And so that's why all of this matters. Because it's not politics, and it's not theology, and it's not concepts. It's human beings made either in the image of God or a beautiful creation that will never repeat again. So I've been talking for a while. I would love to hear what's on your mind. Let's take a few minutes. I'm going to bring this microphone out, and here's what we're going to do. If you have a question or a thought about anything I've shared thus far, anything I've ever written or said that you would like to ask about or hold against me, you can do that. But really, you can hear me talk or read my writing anytime. This is a time for us to have a conversation. So come on up here and ask me, share with us something. What are you hearing, thinking about, wrestling with?
So I am the oldest of 8 siblings, 6 of which are very conservative. So what happens is when we get together, nothing is discussed that is controversial.
Yeah.
Okay? So you feel like you're either beating your head against the wall because half the people, we don't want to talk about that. Mm-hmm. At the same time, you think, so how do you change people, or at least come to an understanding that we have to talk about this with people who are diametrically opposed to what you want to talk about?
Anybody? Thank you. Okay, it's great questions, and this is the front lines of all this stuff. Because remember, when I say these aren't theories, and this isn't just abstract ideas, and it's not just politics and theology, this is your family. One of the things I guess I would say, first of all, is if you have 7 siblings, you may not be able to approach them en masse and get any work done, but you may say, okay, I'm going to have to pick my spots with 1 or 2 of them who may be more receptive. You know, part of what a woman came up to me and during a Q&A, and I remember it was so sweet. She was really, she was real quiet, and she said, I have a beautiful story to tell you. And I said, good, because we love beautiful stories. And she said, I had a really great friend, and she was posting on Facebook some memes that I thought were really disrespectful to people of color. And she said, so I confronted her on her Facebook page, and she unfriended me. I said, lady, I don't know if you know about beautiful stories, but this was horrible, this story. We're all depressed. And she said, but before my friend unfriended me, she said, I got a message in my inbox, a friend request, actually, and then I clicked yes. It was a mutual friend of my friend and me. And she said, this friend said, I'm so grateful for you because I'm a Christian and I've been so disheartened because I believe that no one I see around me actually embraces the teachings of Jesus anymore, and I just wanted to throw it all away, and I saw your post and I was encouraged. And they actually started meeting for coffee, and then now they do activism in Jefferson City, Missouri together. But that would not have happened had she not had the courage to confront her friend publicly. I say that because we have to leverage whatever it is we have. Whether it's our relationships, our circle of influence, whether it's our platform, whether it is our friendships, our family members, because the things that we're going to share may not be heard any other way than by us. Because in that case, she wasn't just talking to her friend, she was talking to the multitude of people who were watching along. And I tell people that all the time. I don't just confront people to confront a person. I want people who are victims of inequity to know that they're worth fighting for. I want them to know that someone actually cares for their humanity, and then I want other people to go, I'm down with this, and join in it. So with our friendships and our families, here's what I have decided. I am not going to be inauthentic with the people I'm supposed to be closest to. And if my family is my family, this has to be the place where I can bring the full contents of my heart at some point. I can't just talk about football and the weather and the kids. Essentially, I have to talk about something real, not just because I want to be in a deep relationship with them, but because people who are victims of racism and homophobia and economic inequities, they deserve to be represented in a conversation where they are not present so that someone's heart can actually be changed. And I've lost more than a few friendships and family members doing this work, but I've realized that sometimes, despite our best efforts, that separation has to happen because that is the collateral damage of working for equity and justice. I don't wish that your relationships with your siblings will blow up, by the way, but maybe you keep slowly, lovingly choosing the words that you can and choosing the spots, because maybe one of those days, one of them is going to be receptive, and all of a sudden it's going to be a part of altering the path of their story. And it may blow up horribly. If it does, I'll send you a book. Someone was saying to me, John, you know, I've got my neighbors, and it's really hard because we're very different theologically and politically. I said, I live in a neighborhood too. Can you imagine what my neighbors know about me? I walk into the Halloween party and everyone goes, oh, I know what you think about everything. And so it's good because it kind of releases me to go, let's just talk about it, right? But again, I don't take this, I'm not being cavalier with your life. But I am saying that the life of people who are under duress, they're worth speaking for, standing with, talking about, getting to know, and risking, because guess what? We may have to just create a whole new community around us. I've had to decide that I have had family and friendships that I thought I would be sharing life with now. I'm not, but I've found a whole new community because of the work I've done, because of the conversations I've had. You're a little closer.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're talking about becoming aware of your privilege,
Yes, ma'am.
and it took me almost about as long as it took you, I think. And it's scary and uncomfortable, but I know that I'm not anywhere near the depth of understanding all of that, what it means, and most importantly, what to do about it.
Well, the first thing is the worst response to becoming aware of the reality of privilege of any kind is to be excessively guilty, and here's why. That is usually some sort of narcissism that says, I'm going to make this about me and how terrible I feel about my privilege. Once you have the awareness, then it's about what is my responsibility? And we all answer that question differently, but for me it was reading more, having different conversations with people, getting to know people of marginalized, vulnerable communities. It was partnering with groups in my organizations in my community that were doing anti-racism work. And it's about having difficult conversations with people I know and love. So there's many layers to it, but it's really about saying, my privilege is, for lack of a better word, it's currency that I can use to have an in with people who would not listen any other way. For example, the whole reason this started for me, this path, was because I wrote a blog post called If I Have Gay Children. All I was doing was trying to humanize the idea of sexuality to people who often dehumanize people who are LGBTQ. And those words exploded, and what they did was they created for me the opportunity to just say to someone, I knew my voice was going to carry differently because I was a white, cisgender, heterosexual male pastor. And I was going to have an audience with people who would never listen to a transgender activist or never listen to the father of a gay person because they dismissed them. But I could have an audience with them, and that's maybe what you have now. You have a circle of influence that is probably made up of many people who are in a place of similar privilege. So you get to be subversive and say, okay, I'm going to work in this, right? Thank you for asking. I mean, it's what it is. It's about every day asking yourself, what are the newer questions I have? When I started getting better stories, it gave me different questions. But here's why that whole thing that we talked about earlier, the fight for equity means I'm probably going to have to do some grieving and realize, oh boy, I've benefited greatly. I'm not going to stay in that place of grieving. I'm going to transfer that grief into something productive. How do you find a peaceful place when you read the news? Which network? Okay, so when you read the news and you try to stay informed, how do you not just crawl into a hole and feel completely hopeless? Well, who says I don't? I do for periods of time. A couple things. When I do a compassion fatigue workshop, and I wish we could do one right now, but let's do a 90-minute one in about 30 seconds. One of the things I share with people is that if they want to avoid burning out and falling into apathy or just getting physically ill, one of the things I want them to do is I want them to get on social media, because what social media does at its best is it allows you to stay informed. It allows you to find your tribes of affinity, right? People who are like-hearted, even if they're not geographically close to you. And social media allows you to perpetuate goodness and truth. And you can put anything out there in the world that you want. So I say, get on social media, stay informed, find your tribe of affinity, and perpetuate goodness. But then I say, then get off social media. Because social media at its worst does this. It artificially enlarges the bad news. Because what we do is we get up and we see something horrible that's done or a piece of legislation that's going to be passed, and we share it because we're interested in making sure people know. But then someone likes it, or they retweet it, or they tag us in it, or they have a conversation, and all of a sudden we start to see that story again and again, and you multiply that by 4 or 5 stories, and by 9 a.m. you could be so overwhelmed because the bad news has been so enlarged. And what I think the challenge is to stay informed and to not allow social media or the media in general we have to right-size the threat, right? It doesn't mean that the threat doesn't exist. It means we don't allow it a too large a space in our heads. And part of that is when it becomes too toxic in me, I step away. Because here's what you have to remember. I don't know if you realize this. Horrible things have always happened. After you die, horrible things will continue to happen. It's not an excuse to not know, but it's to say you cannot die as a martyr of your own heart. You can't say, it's so terrible, I have to give up. I got a letter in the mail 4 years ago now, from a 97-year-old woman. She said, I grew up in the Netherlands. My family suffered under Hitler. My entire family died in the concentration camps in Dachau. And she said, I see history repeating here, and it's terrifying me. And she said, I need you to not stop. And every day when the news gets to me, I say, being so disheartened that I crawl into a hole is not an option. Hopelessness is not an option. Stopping is not an option. The options are stay healthy, stay whole, have meaningful relationships, care for myself, and continue on. And really, that's part of my message for you tonight in the little time that we're going to have left. I don't want you to diminish how bad it is, but I want you to remember how good you are. And that all of the things that you are fearful of losing right now, you're fearful of losing them because someone fought so that we could have them, to lose it all. So the civil rights movement and the movement for LGBTQ equality and the women's movement, we have been beneficiaries of their work. We have inherited their effort. And so now we have this small space and time with which we get to alter the planet. And so we can't blow it. I know you're tired. I'm tired too. But we rest and we keep going, right?
How do we convince white, straight people that it's our job, that we have to stand up and do this?
Okay, yes. And I will say, I started by saying I'm a collector of stories and a war correspondent. And when people share things with me, there is a pattern to what they share. Whether it's a transgender teenager or a migrant father or a Muslim activist or racial justice workers, they never say to me, John, as a white, cisgender, heterosexual male pastor, could you be less bold? Could you be less loud? Could you be less confrontational? What they usually say is, why are so many people of faith who are white so silent right now? Why are so many supposed progressives so silent? And I don't have a great answer for them, but I will say it's really difficult to look at a world and say, the world is a mess. I've benefited from the mess, and now I have to help clean it up. Most of us would rather go, I just don't want to talk politics anymore. And what we get to do, people in this room, especially people here who have a similar pigmentation to me, I know the people you wish were here to hear this, right? You're going, oh, I wish she would hear this. Well, you get to go tell her about it. You get to ask her some of the questions. You get to have coffee. You get to slowly and subversively plant seeds of thought in there. And you get to actually see, this is where you have an advantage over me. We often will do Q&As like this, and someone will go, John, just tell me, though, how do we do this? How do we fix the things that are broken in Grand Rapids? And I go, I don't live here. I'm here to ask you a couple of questions so that you can all get together after this and figure out, what does it look like here on the ground? What does it look like in my workplace, in my church, in my family? So I get off easy. Sorry. This will continue. Okay, thank you. I'm going to paraphrase because there's people who are listening on the recording of this, so I want to just paraphrase what you shared. Basically, it was, hey, I love what you're saying. I've seen people come and say similar things before. And then they're gone, which makes me frightened for me. Okay, and what's it going to take for this kind of movement that we're talking about to flourish? Here's the problem. Let's say we boil this down to progressive spirituality in a broad term, but there are people here who aren't religious, and there are people here who aren't Christian all over the place. But let's say we're talking about progressive spirituality. The problem is a progressive spirituality by nature allows for difference, and it has a posture of curiosity. And we don't have things like hell to leverage to get people urgent and to stay that way. I was meeting with a pastor one time before we were going to go out on Sunday morning. I was going to preach, and I said, all right, I just want to share a couple of things that I'm going to say here on Sunday morning. I don't want you, if you don't want me to say them, I won't say them. And I told him, and he said, no, please say this because I want to and I can't. And I said, well, you could, you just might end up out here with me, right? And the thing was, he said, I actually miss hell. He said, when I had hell, I could motivate people to give, to participate, to vote. I could get them to do anything. And now they don't have hell, he said, it's hard to get my congregation riled up. One of the reasons, sadly, that the progressive movement has a hard time is because it shuns authority from the top. It doesn't want that. Progressive spirituality doesn't want authoritarian. It doesn't want to have it doesn't want to rule by force. It doesn't want to conquer. And that's the problem, because it's always going to be a little bit gentler and difficult to quantify. Someone said to me, why aren't there any Billy Grahams on the left or Franklin Grahams on the left? I said, because we don't want that. This is the only way the movement keeps going is by you walking into your community, and in the here and the small and the now and the close and the doable, you live these things out. We're never going to have there are never going to be liberal megachurches, thank God. Because really, this is about the trenches of life, I think. So I will maybe be gone, and you'll be like, what happened to that John guy? The movement has to carry on through the people here. I mean, that's what it's about. This is not about just some minor Christian celebrity who wrote a blog post, That's the other thing. We don't want that.
I would just love, given why I get up every morning to care for the planet, I would love to hear you talk a few minutes about creation care. Yeah, so that's a lot, but that's my question.
Yeah, see, I opened the microphone, and then I encouraged you to use it, all of you, and you've given me these things that I cannot possibly be equipped to answer. So thank you for that. Here's where I start. I start by actively confronting the horrible theology that the planet is irrelevant because it's just going to hasten the day that Jesus comes back, right? Because there is a theological movement that just says, oh, I can't wait to see Jesus, so why should I recycle? Really. So what I do is I remind people as a person of faith that we are stewards of the gifts that we believe that God has provided, and there is no greater gift than the air that we breathe and the water that sustains us and the planet that we live on. And what I do is I try to be a person of faith who is an expectation-defying Christian. I try to make sure that I talk about the issues that matter to me. And I tell Christians all the time, climate change is the greatest pro-life issue that you could ever adopt, because it's the very essence of what it is to sustain life. And then I just work to dismantle a theology that sees science as irrelevant or conflicting information as a lie. As for how I avoid, curling up in a ball, I grieve tremendously the damage that has been done to the planet largely by people who claim Jesus. But I feel that way about the racism that afflicts us. I feel that way about the hatred of immigrants. I feel horrible that the people of a peacemaker Jesus seem to be perpetuating most of this, which is really sad. I heard Constance talk about her grief, and the only thing I can do is say I grieve it horribly, and there has to be a response to my grief in the small things that I do, in whatever way I use my platform. Yeah, that's just, I had someone say to me, I think she was in Minnesota, and a woman said, John, I hate how angry I am. She said, I'm angry all the time and I don't recognize that person. And I said, well, you may be angry, but you also may be grieving. You may be in mourning, and this may be loss. And she said, that's it. I just realized. And so you're grieving over the planet because you have an intimate understanding of how dire things are. And I have a mother of a transgender student who is deeply grieving the bathroom bills that are being passed, right? And over we have those connection points, and I would just say lean into your individual burdens. The word compassion comes from the word bowels, the idea that you could be so internally disturbed to the point of sickness at something. And so I say, what twists you in your bowels, and move toward that. We just need smart people like you to keep reminding us of the gravity of the situation. I wish there was an easier answer. First of all, I want to thank you for taking time and space and being here, because, as I did say in the beginning, we've never gathered like this before, and because you have all been here, it's changed the gathering, and it's beautiful. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the stuff we've talked about tonight. It's easy because there are so many reasons to grieve, right? There are so many things to be worried about, and we've been in this elevated state of urgency for so long that it's an unnatural way to process the world. And I hear the question you ask yourself over and over: is it me, or has a huge portion of this country lost its mind? It isn't you. That is the good and the terrible news. It's good news because of who it says you are, but it's bad news because of the place and time in which you find yourself. But the fact that you are so disturbed and so filled with grief means your faculties are intact. It means your mind is fully right. It means your heart is working properly. It means you still have a soul doing what a soul is required to do, keep you deeply human in profoundly inhumane times. So if you are frustrated and worried and angry and grieving, celebrate that, because that's your humanity at work. We talked about the stories and the systems, and I know, a gentleman said to me one time, John, there are two news feeds in my life. There's one news feed, it's the news and it's social media, and he said it's the big and it's the far away, and he said that news feed is only going to give me the worst news. It's only going to give me all the discord and all the hatred and all the violence. He said, if I stay in that news feed, I'm going to be overwhelmed. He said, but there's a second news feed. It's down on the ground in the place where I live, the community where I call home, in the lives of people who I know their names and faces and stories, and I know the beautiful things that they're doing. He said, if I'm on that smaller news feed, the hope is easier. And so as we talk about stories and systems tonight, think about the overwhelming system, but that's big and distant. Right now, you enter into the stories through the small and the close, and the here and the now, and the doable. And there you have two things. You have proximity and you have agency, right? I have a good friend, his name is Rod, and Rod lived in Santa Rosa, California. And he and I got to be friends, and he invited me out to his home, and I did a presentation on one of my books. And it was this just amazing home. It's the kind of home that I wanted to put on like booties that they come when they repair your air conditioner, because it was so nice. And I left, and not long after that, he lost his home in the wildfires in California. And I called him that day, the next morning. And he said, John, it was crazy. It was 2:15 in the morning, and we were waking out of a sound sleep, and we had 15 minutes, and we saved what we could, and we left, and the whole thing was gone. And he said this phrase, we saved what we could. And that's really the message tonight. You can't dismantle an entire system that has been here long before you arrived, but you can alter it in the small space of your life. You can't help every white person see the reality of their privilege, but you can actually have conversations with white people. You can't help every faith community affirm the value of LGBTQ human beings, but you can enter into a faith community of your own and you can demand that it happens. You can't change every horrible person on Facebook, but you can actually talk to someone and make a difference. And so that's all I ask. With your voice and with your talents and with your social media platform and your circle of influence and your time and your money, just go out there and save what you can, right? I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for your presence in the world, and you are well loved. Thank you. And we'll see you. Okay? Peace. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Okay, thank you.